questions? Yes.
Hi. So can I ask you to clarify something real quick? So you said that there is a treatment that renders infections virtually undetectable, and that there's like no risk of actually contracting the disease after that, right?
Yes.
Okay. So
that's the undetectable is untransmittable. I forgot I had PowerPoints.
Gotcha.
I don't know if I have enough for all of you.
So that's assuming that the person can actually like acquire treatment and pay for treatment, right?
Absolutely.
Okay,
yes.
So what if the treatment does fail? Because just like with any medicine, I'm assuming that it is susceptible to drug toxicity, resistance, low adherence as well. If it does fail, you don't know until you get that. I think it's called the low viral test.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't it be more prudent to have to disclose to any sex partner that you happen to have in that month that you maybe don't know that you could potentially pass it on, though?
We would argue not by the law. So again, if we're talking about adults who are choosing to have sex with one another, that's going to be between them, to decide to disclose that personal information, not the law. Now, the other thing, let's say, I'm going to take your example even more extreme. Let's say it's somebody like my friend Travis. He was not on treatment. He had a detectable viral load, and he was charged with alleged non-disclosure of his HIV status to his partner. And he never denied that he did not disclose that. So basically admitted, yeah, I did not disclose my HIV status. So the question is, should that be a crime? Or should that be something between those two consensual adults? And our stance is that it should not be a crime because basically they're engaging in the same kind of behavior that other adults are engaging in and not being criminalized for. So now you could say, well, other adults may not have HIV, but they have other things that have very serious consequences sometimes that are not equally criminalized. So a good example would be contraceptive fraud. So an example where like my partner comes to me and says, well, you're on birth control, right? You're on birth control. And I'm not on birth control, and I lie. And I tell him, no, I'm not on birth control. And now suddenly I'm pregnant. Now that's a major life-transforming, event on that person's life who did not want to have a baby. Suddenly they are responsible for taking care of a child that they didn't intend to have. And they get super angry and super pissed at me. You lied to me. You didn't tell me you were on birth control. And they're really upset and they're really infuriated in that sense. But we don't criminalize that because these are adults. And we tend to, in the United States, not criminalize things that adults are engaging in consensually to do that. Now, whether or not you think it would have been the right thing to do between adults, probably most people would say, yeah, that was, you should have told me that you weren't on birth control. But even if they tell you or if they don't, it doesn't necessarily also mean that safe sex will happen. It doesn't even mean that HIV will be transmitted. So with the undetectable, also the interesting thing there is HIV doesn't just suddenly come back like in the thousands. It's not that easily transmitted yet.
So, follow-up question, because you did mention consent. I guess that kind of depends on what it is that we're defining as consent. Is it, yes, I consent to having sex with this person, or is it with informed consent? This person, is this age, maybe has this affliction, maybe isn't on this type of medication, that kind of stuff.
Right, so that's interesting because that's how Canada prosecutes people under their sexual assault laws. Because in the Canadian perspective on how they define non-disclosure, is they say if you didn't disclose your HIV status, it's non-consensual sex because the person didn't know everything about you. So do you see that
yes.
Consent issue? So that's how they're using their sexual assault laws in non-disclosure cases in Canada, because they don't have HIV-specific laws. It's all sexual assault, the non-disclosure, which I think is exactly what you're saying. Isn't this like, what is consent? How do we define consent? So it is exactly how do you define consent. So if you define consent as, I'm only consenting if I know every possible thing about you that I'm consenting to. So the argument that can be made there on where the consent arguments also fail is that we never really know everything about our partners when we consent to engaging in sex. There's all kinds of things that people may not share. And then sex, also the context is very complicated. So is it a one-night stand where I just go out and I hook up with somebody and I never see them ever again? You know, should a law mandate that I tell them everything about me, my personal history, my background, who I am? Because there could be other things that the person could be horrified that they had sex with me that had nothing to do with HIV. It could be that we share a different religion and they never would have hooked up with me because of my religious belief or faith and that sort of thing. And that's very stigmatizing in their particular group or something like that. Or it could be that I live with a severe mental illness and I didn't disclose to them that I live with schizophrenia because I'm afraid that they're going to reject me in that sense. But the consent is a great thing, particularly with the law, because a lot of laws are based on is something consensual and what does that mean and how do we break it down. And so Canada is an interesting country because theirs is all based on that whole kind of argument where they argue it's not informed consent because of that. Yes?
So I'm just curious, like, so I understand your stance on the legalization of informing, but what if, like, because I from my understanding, the undetectable means untransmittable. There's only been 3 studies done on it, and the study concluded that it was very rare. Like, it was unlikely for the transmission, but it's still a very distinct possibility, just insanely unlikely. And then along with the PrEP pill, which has like a 90% effective rate, like there is still a chance that the virus transmits. So like even if they don't consent, but all the precautions are there, but they still transmit it, should that be a crime of infecting someone with HIV?
So the stance of the advocacy, world around this is that it should only be a crime if a person intended to harm another person. So it's the motive factor comes in. And then the question is, let's say I intended to pass on HIV. Okay, I intend to harm you by giving you HIV. Then the question, so that usually that's the first question that's asked, is something going to be subject to criminal law? And if the answer to that is yes, then the question is, did harm actually happen? And whether or not harm actually happened is going to make a difference on the outcome and the punishment. And then if harm happened, then what should the punishment be? So let's say I intended to pass on HIV, and you get HIV. So now you're living the rest of your life with HIV. Let me ask all of you, what should be the punishment? What do you think? Should it be a misdemeanor? Should it be a felony? Should it be 25 years in prison? Should it be a sex offender list? Just any thoughts? I mean, there's no easy answer here, but I just...
But can you quickly recap everything you said?
Recap. So I'm playing off his question about, should it be a crime? So I intend to pass it on. It passes on, and then so now what should be the punishment?
What happens with hepatitis B?
Hepatitis B?
Or C, whichever one that is on.
Well, in Indiana, our law is not based on intent. So intent doesn't matter, just it's based on disclosure. So that's all these laws are based on that. But so where California just modernized their laws, and what they did is they decriminalized, and it's based on intent. So for them, it's a misdemeanor. And part of this is, again, is that you're talking about consensual sex. 2 adults who made a decision to have sex. They didn't have to have sex. The other person could have made a decision to not have sex. The other person could have insisted to use condoms. The other person could have taken PrEP, as you said. So there's all these other, in terms of what can happen here. And then there's the larger kind of public health approach of, what are we doing here? Is this punishment or is this a public health measure? The laws were initially created as a public health measure. They do nothing to prevent the spread of HIV. All they do is punish. And if it's punishment, and that's what people want to do, is punish people who are living with HIV, then they can do that. So in our view, it doesn't matter what your health status is. It doesn't matter whether you're detectable or undetectable. The laws are fundamentally flawed because they don't take into account that intent to harm and whether harm actually occurred. It's just based on a person's status. So you have the disclosure laws, but you also have like the attempting to donate blood or plasma. And then you have the sentence enhancement laws. And the sentence enhancement, I mean, those are also in cases where you're talking about body fluids that don't even transmit HIV. But we'll come back. Let's get a couple other people, then we'll come back. Yeah.
So in 2015, the FDA decided that men engaging in sex with men, they went from a lifelong you can't donate blood to now after a year of having sex, then you can donate blood.
A year of not having sex.
Of not having sex,
Not
then you
having
can donate blood.
Yes.
Do we know if that is based on their interpretations of like HIV transmission, or are there other things?
No, it's still based on HIV transmission coming out of the 80s, on why they haven't just lifted that ban altogether. It's still this fear, what if they have HIV and they're going to transmit HIV? And it makes absolutely no sense, because all the blood is tested. All the blood is tested. So from a blood donation side, you would want the more people that you can get donating that blood, and so you're restricting this whole pool of potential population. And then that's another case. People lie all the time when they go to donate, particularly plasma, for money. And there you're getting very vulnerable groups of people, because often they're donating plasma, because they have unmet, drug needs, and that sort of thing, substance abuse habits, where they're trying to pay and get a fix or whatever it might be there. And people do lie. They lie about the tattoo bans. When did you get that tattoo? Oh, I got that sold. No, that looks fresh. And that sort of thing. So, but yeah, so that now for that is interesting, because that's a policy. Also, there won't be a crime if you attempt to donate blood. If you're gay, if you're a gay man and you attempt to donate blood, you're not going to get a felony conviction. People with HIV will get a felony conviction. Yes, and then we'll go back.
What are the current laws in Indiana around mothers who are trying to have kids who are HIV positive and the transmission between mother to child? Are there any different laws?
It's not in Indiana.
Compared to other states?
No, and no states that I know of have a law that could possibly criminalize mother-to-child transmission, but that has been seen in some of the sub-Saharan African countries, where women who are positive and they become pregnant and they have a baby who's test positive, that they've been criminalized. So then that's actually how I first got interested in this, because my original interest was reproductive rights of people living with HIV, because it was the one experience where I was discriminated against. When I tried to have my own biological child, I was discriminated against in a fertility clinic. They didn't want to provide me care. And that led me to basically advocate for people's reproductive rights. That led me to discover that women living with HIV could be criminalized for becoming pregnant and potentially having a child who was HIV positive. And then that led me to this whole, wow, look at all the different ways that people living with HIV are criminalized, to kind of get to where I am now with this. Go ahead, and then we'll go to the back. Okay.
So you mentioned things that had to do with reproductive, not in this sense, but you were talking about how if a woman doesn't disclose to the man that she's pregnant, or that she's not on the pill, or if a man's not wearing a condom, then, they have that life-changing thing and they have a kid. In most cases, the parent, the paternal parent, is usually ordered by the court to provide financial means to the maternal parent to support that child. Applying that to the HIV non-disclosure issue, if a person doesn't disclose that they have HIV, pass it on to that person, do they have to then, or would it make sense to then have that person provide the financial means for medical care and treatment to that person they pass it on to?
Some people have argued that they should have to pay for their medical treatment. But no, the answer there would be no, that they're not. That this is basically an illness, that you could have other illnesses you could also pass on that aren't criminalized. So if we're going to do that, we should also criminalize HPV. So we can ask how many of us are living with HPV. I would say probably, if all of you felt comfortable raising your hand, probably about 80% of us in this room have human papillomavirus. Now, human papillomavirus is an interesting comparison to HIV, because more women die from cervical-related cancer associated with HPV every year than we even see people living with HIV die from AIDS-related complications. So there's the other point there, that HIV is being treated differently. So you're creating this viral underclass because of HIV, and it's not being treated similarly to other STDs. Now, some places like California, when they changed their law, they got rid of the HIV felony law, and they subsumed HIV under their other STDs, because they do have STD non-disclosure and intent to pass it on is a crime, but it's only a misdemeanor. So they treated it like the other STIs. And in Indiana, we don't have a law like that. And the stance is that no disease, nobody living with the disease because of their disease should be criminalized. That would be discriminatory based upon a person's health status. Violates the ADA, all this sort of thing. So we can't just assume, and we wouldn't want to suddenly say, well, let's criminalize all the people with hepatitis, with hepatitis or human papillomavirus or herpes. It's another one as well that normally doesn't have major consequences, but can, particularly for women if they become pregnant.
So I have a follow-up question
Yes,
with
and
regards to
then
that.
the women in the
Okay,
back and
sorry, I don't want to
yeah,
dominate.
go ahead.
So in the instance of HIV versus HPV or herpes you mentioned, I would assume that the cost of treating HIV is a lot greater than, say, herpes treatment, correct?
Herpes, yes, but I wouldn't say human papillomavirus if you get cervical cancer.
Well, assuming you don't get cervical cancer.
In
The
some
cost is a lot.
In some way, you could also say, like, for example, the cost of hepatitis C to treat that is much higher than the cost to treat HIV. So some illnesses are much higher than HIV because HIV is much more manageable. So the cure for hepatitis C right now is outrageously expensive. There is a cure, but it's outrageously expensive and costs much more to basically treat hepatitis C than HIV. But these are great questions because you're trying to say, well, what about the equal harms? What about, are we treating equally? What about these other sorts of things? The kind of public health stance is you don't criminalize people living with HIV or any other disease. There are public health measures. If somebody poses such a public health risk, you can be quarantined. Not a lot of people know that, but the state actually has the power and the ability to take me out of society and put me in a hospital and say, you cannot leave here as a public health measure. The state can do, they only do those in extreme cases, but we have public health measures to kind of take care of if there is an extreme public health risk. They can do that without criminalizing people with a particular disease, because the criminalization has these harmful effects that then it creates, it's almost like a catch-22, where you criminalize as a way, well, aren't we helping? But actually it backfires and leads to stopping the HIV epidemic.